He wasn't supposed to survive. The lion cub was barely breathing when Daniel first found him. Skin clinging to bone, eyes crusted shut, ribs rising and falling with desperate effort. Abandoned by his pride or perhaps orphaned, no one knew. But the cub had been left to die, discarded like something broken. Daniel wasn't a rescuer by trade. He wasn't a vet, a biologist, or some expert on wildlife. He was just a man passing through, working with a conservation team in rural South Africa, mostly doing grunt work, building fences, hauling equipment, fixing things. But when he found the cub curled beside a log, unmoving and half covered in flies, something inside him shattered. He didn't think. He just picked him up. The cub didn't fight, didn't even flinch, just lay limp in his arms, trusting him completely in a way that tore Daniel's heart open. He brought the cub back to camp, ignoring the looks, ignoring the warnings. He won't make it. It's better to let nature take its course. But Daniel didn't believe in letting things die just because the odds were bad. He named him Leo. The next days were chaos. Bottle feeding, sleepless nights, constant cleaning, vet calls, more doubt. But Leo began to change. First, he opened his eyes, then he cried, a soft, raspy sound that was more breath than roar, but to Daniel it was music. Soon, Leo could crawl, then stand, then stumble after Daniel like a fluffy shadow with oversized paws and endless curiosity. People warned him, "Don't get attached, he's not a pet, he'll have to go back to the wild someday." But Daniel already was attached. He couldn't help it. Leo slept in his bed, climbed into his lap like a clumsy dog, played tug-of-war with his boots. When Daniel sat down, Leo was always right there. Head on his knee, tail flicking, purring like a tractor. Daniel had raised animals before, but none like Leo. None that looked him in the eyes with such knowing. None that made him laugh through tears when he'd had the worst days. Leo wasn't just a lion. He was a companion. A part of Daniel's soul, but lions grow. By 8 months, Leo was already stronger than any dog, his play now dangerous even when unintentional. By 1 year, he was wild, still affectionate, still Daniel's boy, but filled with instincts that couldn't be ignored. And Daniel knew. The day would come. He had raised Leo to live, not just in a house, not just under human care, but to be free. So when the sanctuary team offered a protected, open reserve, fenced but massive, full of wildlife, designed for rewilding, Daniel said yes. He didn't sleep the night before letting go. When he opened the transport gate, Leo stepped out slowly. He didn't roar. He just looked back. Once. Long enough to make Daniel's chest ache like it was being torn in two. Then Leo disappeared into the brush. Daniel stood there long after he was gone, alone, but convinced he had done the right thing. Daniel didn't talk about Leo for a long time. People asked sometimes. Those who'd seen them together during the early days. Those who remembered the bond. They'd smile and say things like, "He's probably king of the bush now, huh?" Or, "Bet he's out there hunting zebras, living the dream." Daniel would nod and give a small smile. But inside, it still hurt. He knew Leo wasn't his pet, he never had been. But letting him go hadn't felt like setting him free. It had felt like giving up a part of himself, something no one warned him about. At night, he'd sometimes dream of Leo's wide golden eyes, of that clumsy cub crawling up into his lap. He'd wake up reaching for something that wasn't there anymore. The reserve team sent updates occasionally, photos from camera traps, grainy images of lions lounging beneath trees, or trailing gazelle. They couldn't confirm which one was Leo. None of the lions wore collars in that part of the reserve. No names, no tags. That was the point. Daniel tried to let go. He poured himself into other rescues. Smaller animals, birds, even a wounded cheetah once. But nothing filled the hollow Leo had left behind. 2 years passed. Then one day an opportunity came from nowhere. The reserve director, an old gruff man named Petrus, called him out of the blue. "We think he's still around," he said. "A big male, lone, keeps coming close to the northern fence line. Doesn't mix with the other prides, but he's not aggressive, just watches." Daniel's heart nearly stopped. "Leo? We can't say for sure, but he's different." Daniel didn't wait. He packed a bag, grabbed his old boots, and drove straight through the night to the reserve. The whole way, memories flooded in. Leo curled in his passenger seat, pawing at the glove box, or sticking his head out the window like some overgrown puppy. When he reached the reserve gate, Petrus met him with his usual scowl. "We'll take you up to the northern bluff tomorrow," he said. "Sunrise. He's been there every morning this week, no guarantees." Daniel nodded, heart hammering. That night he didn't sleep. He just sat outside the tent, staring into the dark, listening to the sounds of the wild, the chirps, the rustles, the distant roars. And then, just before dawn, he heard it. A low, familiar sound. It wasn't loud, it wasn't meant to scare. It was deep, soft, almost questioning. Daniel froze. He knew that sound. Every cell in his body recognized it. It was Leo. He stood slowly, scanning the tree line. And then, emerging from the shadows like a ghost, he saw him. Massive, majestic, golden mane framing his face like fire. Leo. He was full-grown now, a beast. But his eyes, those eyes were still the same. And they were locked on Daniel. Neither of them moved. Daniel whispered, "Hey, boy." And Leo took one step forward. He took another step, slow, measured, deliberate. Daniel stood still. His instinct screamed to run, to back away, to respect the space between man and lion, but he didn't. He couldn't. Because deep down, past every fear, was something stronger. Recognition. Leo's golden eyes never blinked, never wandered. They stayed on Daniel like they were trying to read his soul. His massive body, now muscle and power, moved with grace, but there was hesitation too, like even he couldn't believe what he was seeing. And then it happened. Leo let out a soft, rumbling sound, not a roar, not even a growl, a purr, deep and low, like distant thunder. Daniel's chest clenched. "I missed you," he whispered, barely able to speak. Leo moved again, closing the distance between them, each step heavier than the last, until they stood just feet apart. The same lion who now ruled this territory, who could take down a wildebeest on his own, stood in silence before the man who once bottle-fed him with trembling hands. For a second, Daniel feared it might be over. That wild instinct would take over, that this beautiful reunion was just a trick of memory and hope. He braced himself, and Leo nuzzled him, gently, just like when he was a cub. He leaned his massive head against Daniel's chest, brushing it softly, closing his eyes for a second as if to say, "I remember." Daniel broke. He dropped to his knees, tears slipping down his face as he wrapped his arms around the lion's neck, overwhelmed by the miracle in front of him. Leo didn't pull away. He stayed there, still and calm, letting Daniel hold him like he used to. 2 years, 2 lifetimes, 2 completely different worlds. And somehow, love had survived it all. The reserve rangers had gathered behind a safe distance, silent, some filming the moment with wide eyes. Petrus stood back, arms crossed, shaking his head slowly like he couldn't believe it. No one said a word, because words didn't belong here. Daniel pulled back slightly, placing a hand on Leo's mane. "You remember me, don't you?" Leo licked his hand once, just once. Then sat down in front of him like a giant, loyal sentinel. Not wild, not tame, something else, something between. For a while, they stayed like that. No movement, no rush, just quiet presence. Then Leo stood, slowly, and turned his head toward the wild, toward the deeper brush. It was time. He looked back once, just once, then walked away with the same slow, deliberate grace he had arrived with. Daniel didn't follow. He didn't need to, because that moment, that reunion, had said everything. Leo remembered, and so did Daniel. The drive back felt heavier than the drive there. Daniel sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel, eyes unfocused as the trees blurred past. The other rangers in the vehicle spoke in hushed voices behind him, still trying to process what they had witnessed. A man hugging a lion purring like a cub, a connection stronger than time, distance, or even nature itself. Petrus sat in the passenger seat, arms folded, watching Daniel carefully. "You know," he said after a long pause, "I've worked with lions for 30 years, seen mothers abandon their own, seen siblings fight to the death over scraps. But that wasn't instinct, that was memory." Daniel didn't reply. His throat was still tight. The image of Leo's massive head pressing against his chest played over and over in his mind like a song on repeat. That weight, that sound, that warmth. It wasn't just a reunion, it was forgiveness, and maybe even thanks. Back at camp, the team uploaded the video. It spread like wildfire. Across the reserve, across neighboring communities, then across the world. Within days, it was everywhere. Man raises lion cub, reunites years later. What happens will break you. The clip showed Daniel kneeling, Leo's massive body approaching, the purring, the nuzzle. The moment they touched like no time had passed. People cried, commented in every language. Some said it gave them hope. Others said it shattered them. A few doubted the video, called it fake, said it must have been staged. But most people just felt it, deep down where you don't need to explain anything. Love, after all, doesn't need subtitles. Interviews came next. News stations, wildlife magazines. Everyone wanted to talk to the man who had hugged a lion. Daniel declined most of them. "It wasn't about me," he said simply. "It was about him." But what people didn't see, what no video showed, was the way Daniel would walk to the edge of the reserve every morning after that. Same spot, same time, just in case. He never expected Leo to come back. Not really, but hope, once lit, is a hard thing to extinguish. And sometimes Daniel swore he could hear it again. That low, rumbling purr, somewhere deep in the trees. One morning, Petrus walked up beside him, holding a small notebook. "Rangers have been tracking him," he said. "Leo, we're sure now. He's staked out a territory in the northern range, follows the same patrol path every 3 days. Alone, but strong. Healthy, dominant." Daniel's lips curved into a small smile. "Sounds like he's doing all right." "He is." Petrus paused, then added, "But here's the strange part. His trail always ends near the same tree line, then disappears for a while. No clear signs of hunting, no movement, he just stops." Daniel looked at him. "Stops and waits?" he asked. Petrus nodded, like he's expecting something. Daniel's heart ached in the best possible way. Maybe he wasn't the only one still hoping. 3 weeks passed before it happened again. Daniel had returned to his normal work, checking fences, monitoring water sources, helping relocate a small injured antelope to a safer enclosure. Life at the reserve had settled back into its quiet rhythm. But he still walked out to the northern fence line each morning, just in case. He told himself it was just routine, that the moment had passed, that what happened before, Leo recognizing him, showing affection, it was a one-time gift. Beautiful, yes, but not something to expect again. Still, he kept going, and then, one morning, as the sun had barely begun to stretch across the horizon, he saw the silhouette. Leo, standing still on the ridge. Not moving, not roaring, just watching. Daniel's breath caught. He didn't call out this time. He simply stood there, letting the silence stretch between them like a bridge. Leo took a step forward, then another. and another, until he was right there again, towering, golden, eyes wide with the same knowing look. No cameras this time, no rangers, just them. And when Daniel extended his hand, Leo leaned his head forward and pressed into it. Firmly, this time, almost like he'd been waiting. Daniel couldn't stop the tears. "You came back," he whispered. Leo made a soft grunt, his way of answering. Then he circled Daniel once, rubbing his massive body along his side like a cat greeting an old friend. There was no fear, no hesitation. And that's when Daniel knew this wasn't random. Leo remembered, not just once, not just that day, but every day. Somewhere deep inside that wild, powerful body, the cub he'd raised still lived. Not just in memory, but in love. For the next hour they sat together. Daniel didn't speak much. Leo rested his body in the grass beside him, eyes half closed, purring every few minutes. At one point, Leo rolled onto his side, letting Daniel stroke his mane, just like the old days. And then, just as calmly as he'd arrived, Leo stood. He looked out at the open land behind him, then back at Daniel. "Time to go?" Daniel nodded, forcing a smile through wet eyes. "Go on, you've got a kingdom to run." Leo lingered a moment longer, then turned and walked away. But not before doing one last thing. He let out a roar. Not a loud, aggressive one, but something soft and drawn out. A goodbye, a promise, a sound that echoed across the trees and left Daniel standing there with his heart thudding like a drum. That roar stayed with him, in his dreams, in the quiet hours of the morning, in the stories people asked him to tell over and over again. He didn't care who believed it. He knew what he saw, what he felt. A lion had remembered him, and not even time could break that bond. Weeks turned into months, and still Leo came. Not every day, not even every week, but often enough that Daniel began to mark it in his journal. Leo visit, calm, nuzzled, stayed 47 minutes. Laid beside me today, slept, he trusts me. Sat watching the sunrise together. No fear. It became their unspoken ritual, man and lion. Two lives that should have drifted apart forever, finding their way back again and again. Sometimes Leo would just sit beside Daniel, watching the wind roll over the grasslands. Other times, he'd rest his massive head in Daniel's lap, like he used to when he was small. Daniel would stroke his mane, fingers running through the thick golden fur, remembering the tiny ball of fluff he used to cradle in his arms. And every time Leo turned to leave, he would pause, just for a moment, just long enough for Daniel to know, this isn't goodbye. People came from all over asking to see it happen. Some wanted to film, to document the phenomenon. A full-grown lion choosing to return, over and over, to the human who raised him. But Daniel always said no. "This isn't a show," he'd tell them. "It's a friendship." It wasn't about cameras or attention. It was sacred. The reserve respected that. Petrus made sure of it. He set up a new sign near the northern range. Restricted access, lion territory. But he added a smaller note underneath. Some bonds don't need fences. Then, one morning, Leo didn't come. Daniel waited. The next day and the day after that. Nothing. No paw prints, no rustling in the tall grass, no low, rumbling purr. Just the wind. A week passed, then two. Daniel tried to stay calm. Lions roamed. Sometimes they moved for food, for water, for females. This wasn't unusual, he told himself. Leo was wild. He had his own life. But the ache in Daniel's chest said otherwise. He returned to his routine, forcing himself to focus on the work. But the spark that Leo had left in him, the quiet fire of connection, that felt dimmer now. Until a ranger ran up to the camp one morning, panting, eyes wide. "Sir, there's something you need to see. North Bluff, it's urgent." Daniel's heart dropped. "Leo?" The ranger just nodded. Daniel didn't wait. He jumped into the truck, drove hard across the dirt road, the engine roaring louder than his thoughts. When they reached the ridge, he saw it. Leo was there, but he wasn't alone. A lioness, and beside her, 3 tiny cubs barely old enough to stand. Leo stood watch over them all, tail swishing, eyes alert. But the moment he saw Daniel, his posture shifted, relaxed, almost proud. Daniel stepped out of the vehicle, breath catching. "You brought your family." Leo let out a soft, familiar grunt, as if to say, "This is where it all started. I wanted them to see." Daniel laughed, a shaky, joy-filled laugh that turned into quiet tears. He wasn't just part of Leo's past. He was part of Leo's legacy. Daniel couldn't move. He stood frozen at the edge of the ridge, heart pounding, eyes locked on the scene before him. Leo, the wild king, now a father. A protector not just of territory but of something far more fragile. The lioness watched Daniel with caution. She stayed close to her cubs, muscles tensed, instincts high. She didn't know who he was. To her, he was just a man, one more unpredictable creature in a world full of threats. But Leo stepped between them, not as a warning but as a reassurance. He looked back at her, gave a low rumble, and then, surprisingly, sat down beside Daniel. The message was clear. He's safe. He's one of us. The lioness didn't approach, but she didn't flee either. She allowed the moment. And the cubs? They peeked out from behind her legs with wide eyes and twitching ears, unaware that they were witnessing something nearly impossible. Daniel lowered himself slowly, sitting cross-legged on the ground a few feet away, trying not to blink too much, afraid it would all vanish if he looked away for even a second. Leo looked over at him, that same deep calm in his eyes. Not the eyes of a pet. Not the eyes of a tamed animal, but of something even rarer, an equal. "You've got cubs," Daniel whispered, barely able to contain his smile. "You're a dad now." Leo lifted his head proudly, as if understanding every word. The lioness lay down, finally resting. The cubs climbed over her, tumbling, squealing, batting at each other's tails. One of them wandered a little too far, toward Daniel's direction. Instinctively, Daniel held his breath. He didn't move. Leo watched closely but didn't react. The tiny cub stopped, stared at Daniel with curious, innocent eyes, then let out a tiny sneeze and rolled over on its back. Daniel smiled. His eyes blurred again, not from sadness, this time from something else. Something warmer. This was what life had become. Not just one reunion, not just one miracle, but a continuing gift. Leo wasn't just remembering Daniel anymore. He was sharing him with his family, saying, "This is the man who gave me a second chance. I trust him. You can too." Petrus and the team arrived quietly after a while, standing a respectful distance behind, watching in disbelief. No one dared disturb the moment. The wind carried the soft sounds of the cubs playing, the lioness's breathing, and the steady heartbeat of a man whose life had been forever changed by a lion he once fed with a bottle. Daniel sat there for hours, just breathing the same air, taking it all in. Eventually, the family rose. The lioness led the cubs away toward the distant trees. Leo lingered, turning back once more. He walked over to Daniel, lowered his head, and pressed his forehead gently to Daniel's, just for a heartbeat. Then he was gone again. Not forever. Just until the next time. Daniel didn't speak for the rest of the day. When he returned to camp, the others gave him space. No one pushed for stories or asked for photos. They had seen the look in his eyes, something between awe and reverence. He had just witnessed something sacred. That night, he sat outside alone, eyes fixed on the stars. He replayed every moment. Leo's quiet pride, the lioness's cautious trust, the cub tumbling in the grass like life had never been dangerous. It was surreal, like stepping into a dream and never wanting to wake up. He thought about the first time he held Leo in his arms, weak, dying, barely breathing. No one had believed the cub would survive, but now that same cub had become a father, a protector, a symbol of everything Daniel had fought for, and somehow, impossibly, Leo had never forgotten. Over the next few weeks, the visits continued, not every day, not always up close, but Leo always came near, sometimes alone, sometimes with his lioness and the cubs trailing behind him like fluffy shadows. They never crossed too far into the human zone, but whenever Daniel was there, Leo would draw close, acknowledging him with a low rumble or a slow, steady glance. It was their language. No words, just presence. One afternoon, as Daniel sat sketching near the ridge, a new hobby he'd picked up to capture the moments Leo gave him, he heard soft footsteps. Not heavy enough to be Leo, not cautious enough to be the lioness. It was one of the cubs, the bold one, the one who had sneezed in front of him that first day. Daniel didn't move, didn't even lift his head. He waited. The cub came closer, sniffed the air, then curiously pawed at the edge of Daniel's boot. A puff of air left Daniel's lungs. He slowly looked up and saw Leo, just behind the trees, watching. Calm. Watching. Not to stop it, but to allow it. The cub pawed at Daniel's sketchpad next, smearing one of the drawings. Daniel chuckled under his breath. "That was supposed to be your dad." The cub yawned, unimpressed, then plopped down beside him. Daniel didn't dare touch him. Not yet. But he didn't need to. The closeness was enough. A few minutes later, the lioness appeared, calling softly. The cub stood, gave Daniel one last glance, then ran off, tail flicking in the air. Daniel sat in silence again. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the moment said everything. He was no longer just a visitor to Leo's world. He was part of its roots, its memory, its future. And Leo wasn't just returning out of affection. He was introducing Daniel to his legacy, one cub at a time. A few months later, things began to change. Leo's cubs were growing fast. No longer clumsy balls of fluff, but lean, sharp-eyed young lions. Their roars, once squeaky and playful, now carried a hint of real power. They wrestled harder, ran faster, and challenged each other like they were preparing for the wild world waiting beyond the safety of their small family pride. And Daniel watched all of it like a proud uncle who'd somehow ended up in the middle of a story he never meant to write. But he knew. He knew it couldn't stay this way forever. Leo was still king of his range, still dominant, still strong, but signs of age were beginning to show. His mane, once fire golden, had streaks of black. He rested more. His steps were still confident but carried the weight of a lion who had earned every scar. Daniel noticed first the way Leo sat a little longer after rising, how his breaths came heavier after short walks, the way he would pause before leaping onto rocks he used to conquer with ease. No one said it aloud, but Daniel knew. Leo's time wasn't ending, but it was beginning to slow. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the land in warm gold, Daniel sat by the usual ridge. He hadn't seen Leo in over a week, not unusual, but enough to leave an ache in his chest. Then, from the distance, he saw him, alone. No cubs, no lioness, just Leo, walking slowly, deliberately, toward the ridge like he had so many times before. When he reached Daniel, he didn't nuzzle, didn't lie down, he just stood there, watching. Daniel stood too, sensing something unspoken. Leo took one step closer and did something he hadn't done in a long, long time. He pressed his head gently to Daniel's chest, and this time, Daniel didn't cry. He just closed his eyes, laid his hands on Leo's broad neck, and breathed in the moment. If this was a goodbye, it was a quiet one. No fanfare, no dramatic ending, just presence. Leo pulled back and sat down beside him. For over an hour they stayed there, Two old friends who had nothing left to prove, no more time to waste. Then Leo stood, glanced back once, and walked into the grass. Daniel watched until the lion disappeared from view. The next day, Leo didn't return, nor the next. Weeks passed. The reserve team tracked his pride. The lioness and cubs were healthy, thriving. But Leo was gone. No body, no signs of struggle, just gone. Like he had chosen the moment himself. Like he had come to say farewell on his own terms. Daniel didn't weep. He smiled, wiped one tear, and whispered into the wind, "You lived free, just like I promised you." And deep in his heart he knew Leo's story wasn't over. Because legends like him don't end. They echo. Years passed, but the story never faded. New volunteers came to the reserve. New animals arrived, new challenges rose. But one name always lingered in the air, Leo. Whispered like a myth. Spoken with reverence. Not just as a lion, but as a legend. They called him the lion who loved a man. They didn't see the early days, when Leo was barely alive, a fragile cub curled in the arms of someone who refused to give up. They didn't see the late nights, the feedings, the fear, the hope. But Daniel remembered, every second. He'd become something of a quiet icon himself. People came from all over to meet him, to ask him how he raised a lion that never forgot. Daniel never made himself a spectacle. He just smiled, told the truth, and when asked about Leo, he'd say one simple thing. He wasn't mine, I was his. Sometimes he'd walk alone to the northern ridge, where Leo used to wait. The tree line still looked the same. The wind still carried the same rustle. But it wasn't silence, it was filled with echoes, of a low purr, of paws on dirt, of the soft grunt Leo used to greet him with. He visited the pride often. The lioness was older now, still strong, still sharp. And the cubs? Grown, majestic, powerful. One of them, a young male with deep eyes and Leo's proud shoulders, would often break away from the others when Daniel came near. He'd sit, close but not too close, watching him, studying. Almost like he knew, like his father had passed on more than instincts. One day, that lion approached Daniel, calm, curious. Not with the boldness of youth, but with the careful grace Leo once had. Daniel didn't move. And just like his father once had, the young lion leaned in and gently pressed his forehead to Daniel's chest. It was the same gesture, the exact same weight. Daniel gasped, his hands trembled. For a moment, time bent, and it was like Leo had returned through his bloodline, like that old unbreakable bond had reached across the years and found a way back to him. He knelt and whispered through tears, "You remember, don't you? Not just him, but the feeling, the trust, the love." And the lion simply stood, gave one long exhale, then turned back to his siblings and melted into the grass. Daniel stayed on the ground, hand over his heart, breath shaking. He didn't need Leo to walk the ridge anymore, because Leo had never truly left. He lived in the land now, in his pride. In the way that young lion paused to look back at Daniel, not with fear, but with recognition. He lived in every whispered story passed between ranger and volunteer, in every sunset that bathed the savannah gold, in every heart that still believed a lion could love a man. And for the rest of his life, Daniel never walked alone, because love like that, it echoes forever.